Mabuhay. Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 15 on the crimes of Peter Scully and the problem of online sexual exploitation of children. As always, sources used for my research can be found on Lagim's website, and I will also add any extra sources which I think will be helpful in better understanding this serious matter. Content warning. This story contains details of child abuse, child sexual assault, torture, and murder. So please make sure to take care of yourself whilst listening. The year is 2012, and a certain part of the internet, a part that a normal user like you and I does not normally see or easily access, is abuzz. But for all the wrong reasons. A certain video was making its rounds, and for all intents and purposes, it has gone viral, but only amongst those who stay in this dark underbelly of the internet, where seemingly everything that is evil, wrong, criminal, and debauched resides. This video will blow wide open an issue in the Philippines that most citizens might either not fully know about or will not want to know more about. The video was shot and circulated by an Australian man by the name of Peter Scully, who made Malaybalay Bukidnon his lair. Even though this episode will mainly focus on Peter Scully, make no mistake that his crimes are not unique and are merely a symptom of a bigger and much complicated problem. But we will treat him as our starting point in order to further explore the issues of online sexual exploitation of children. So, who is Peter Gerard Scully? Scully, as far as the internet is concerned, hails from Melbourne, Australia, and used to live in a neighborhood called Nar Warren. At one point, Scully was married, and he is the father of two children, but that marriage eventually broke down. Neighbors described him as dodgy even then. This reputation was not helped when Scully brought home with him at one point a teenage Malaysian girl who he introduced as his girlfriend. In reality, he pimped out this poor girl at so-called sex parties in his suburban area and had her work as an escort as well. At this point, Scully's days in Australia were actually numbered because he was also involved in some serious fraud cases in which he duped around 20 investors out of a total amount of 2.36 million Australian dollars in investment. So in 2009, the Australian police started an investigation into Scully's fraudulent activities, and by 2011, they were ready to charge Scully with 117 counts of fraud and deception offenses. However, Scully was already gone by 2011. He had already fled to the Philippines by then. The Australian authorities alerted airports and other points of entry into Australia in the hope that upon Scully's return, he could be arrested, but he never flew back to Australia. Instead, he landed in Manila and quickly moved south to Mindanao to settle down there. Whatever depraved motivations he had when he pimped out his teenage Malaysian girlfriend back in Melbourne would soon be used to establish a well-connected pedophile online network that traded in child pornography of the most awful nature. The consumers were mostly men from the West, India, and the Middle East. And the children? They were mostly from wherever Scully lived over the years in Mindanao. Whilst his first year of running his network largely went unnoticed by authorities, Scully's day of reckoning would come sooner than he had thought a year later in 2012. I know I had already given you a content warning at the beginning of this episode, but I cannot emphasize enough how upsetting some of the details of this story are. I will try to keep everything general. No specific details will be given here, but still, consider yourself warned. In 2012, as I already indicated, a particular video made its rounds among Scully's online pedophile network, and eventually to some parts of the dark web frequented by those consuming child pornography. The video was published on Scully's dark web child pornography website called No Limits Fun and was called Daisy's Destruction. It is said to be the worst child sexual abuse video to have ever been made, that for a while, people who were not privy to the depraved and sickening pedophilic corner of the dark web thought that the video was an urban legend. Unfortunately, it is not. The depraved beings who would watch this kind of material had dubbed this genre hurtcore, which is disturbingly self-explanatory. Daisy's Destruction, the video, featured the most horrible torture and abuse and even rape of 3 children called Lisa, Cindy, and Daisy. One was 12 years old, the other 11, and the youngest a mere 18 months old. The perpetrators were Scully himself, plus some of his Filipino girlfriends, one of whom is called Lisel Margallo. Margallo was seen in the video to be horribly brutalizing Daisy, the 18-month-old baby. As the police authorities would later find out, these children were freely handed over by their impoverished parents to Scully, thinking he would provide them with food, shelter, and the chance to go to school. They did not know the horror that Scully had in store for them instead. Now, I have not seen this video, nor will I ever want to see it or advise anyone to watch it. But in one YouTube video, a Filipino lawyer and police officer conveyed how horrible this video was. They said that after watching the video and having to watch it a few more times during the investigation, they ended up having nightmares for months or years after they first had to watch it. That was frankly enough for me to understand what kind of video this was and what kind of person Scully is as well. The video was originally meant to be watched only by those who were willing to pay for it. According to reports, pedophiles across Scully's network paid him between $100 and $10,000 for the Daisy video and other videos he produced before it. In the Daisy video, however, one pay-per-view customer eventually made the video public, and that was when, for the first time, police authorities became aware of it. Dutch police authorities were one of the first police entities who had become aware of the video. They decided to start their own investigation as they thought they heard someone speaking Dutch in the video. Their investigation into Scully was also a small part in a much larger operation to track down European-based consumers of online child sexual exploitation material. It was the Dutch police authorities who managed to isolate this video, this Daisy video, as being from the Philippines. This was when they alerted the Philippine authorities. Other authorities subsequently followed suit in helping the manhunt for the people involved in the video. The Australian Federal Police authorities became quickly involved after they finally figured out that the white man in the video, later to be identified as Peter Scully, did not in fact speak Dutch, but spoke English with an Australian accent. The Australians then started becoming more deeply involved in helping the NBI, or the National Bureau of Investigation with their efforts in tracking down Scully. Paul Hopkins, who is a federal police officer from Australia, told 60 Minutes Australia that Scully is the most depraved individual he has ever come across in 26 years of being a police officer. Hopkins was the one who recognized Scully's Australian accent from the Daisy video, and he would also be one of the many people who would help the investigation in tracking down Scully for 3 years. Yes, Scully's arrest was 3 years in the making. But how was Scully eventually discovered anyway? Whilst the international manhunt was underway, Scully had been freely producing his sexual abuse content in Bukidnon, Mindanao. He was living with girls who he considered his girlfriends, all of them so obviously younger than him and all of them minors. Two of the most notable girlfriends were Lizelle Margallo, who I have already mentioned before. The other one was Carmi Ann Alvarez. Carmi herself was picked up and groomed by Scully before becoming his accomplice, which makes me think that Scully was very calculating in his crimes, always moving with intent and always thinking like he would never get caught. So, what did the early efforts of tracking down Scully look like? Carmi Ann would later relate that Scully had asked her one day to pick up some street kids. He wanted two, aged 9 and 12 specifically. He said he wanted to help them. Carmi Ann followed Scully's orders and went on to look for two street kids she could present to him. Carmi managed to lure in two girls with the offer of food. The girls were related to each other as they were cousins. After dropping them off at Scully's place, Carmi left the girls alone with Scully, knowing full well what Scully was capable of doing to the young girls. Carmi Ann would later say that when she came back 2 days later to Scully's place, both girls had dog collars around their necks. Carmi was sure that both had been sexually abused and injured by Scully already. One of the girls, the 12-year-old, would confirm this, adding that after Scully put dog collars on them, he forced them to dig their own graves. Scully then threatened them, saying that they will be put in those graves soon. It goes without saying that this was a harrowing experience for those two kids. They were left traumatized and confused about what was going on. I keep thinking that in all cultures, Filipino or not, children should be able to really rely on adults for safety and protection. When the very people in positions of power hurt those who can barely defend themselves, there is an added sinister element in the actions of said people in power. In Scully's case, he indulged his most depraved fantasies with reckless abandon, destroying the lives of children whilst also profiting from them. Now, later on, the two street girls also revealed in the same interview with 60 Minutes Australia that Carmi Ann also hurt them, mainly making sure the two girls complied with Scully's sick wishes through the use of force. Now, 5 days after kidnapping the girls, Carmi Ann claimed she had a change of heart and decided to release the girls. The girls could not run away quick enough from that house of horror and away from Scully. The children went to the police, who at this point had a genuine shot at apprehending Scully. The police mobilized and were set to arrest Scully and Carmi Ann, but Scully was able to evade them this time, leaving Carmi Ann, who was arrested immediately. So, the investigation had to continue. I mentioned before how the Dutch and Australian police were important in the international manhunt for Scully. However, Paul Hopkins, the Australian federal police officer who I mentioned earlier, had to emphasize that it was the Filipino police authorities who did the dirty work, the groundwork, if you will, of tracing Scully's whereabouts, knocking door to door, checking the interior of different houses in the areas where Scully was known to move around. The goal was to match the interiors of the house they saw in the Daisy video to the ones in the local area. After all, the police still needed their primary crime scene. Not too soon after Carmian's arrest, it looked like the police were hot on Peter Scully's heels. Intel given by the local community confirmed that the police were not too far off in their efforts in tracking down Scully, who was doing his best to lay low. The police would find out around this time that Scully actually used at least 15 houses to operate his international pedophile network, and he had likely hid himself in one of those houses. But these houses still needed to be identified by the police. In one of these 15 houses, the NBI finally found the House of Horror, used as a setting for the Daisy video. They finally had their crime scene. In the 60 Minutes Australia video, which I have included in the sources list, the house looked so normal. Initially, it looked like every other Filipino household, but the rooms upstairs quickly gave the impression that horrible and unspeakable violence had taken place in them. So, if you are ready, do watch the video if you get the time. Police authorities in the Philippines also run a parallel search for the 3 children in the Daisy video, as well as looking for Scully. It was important for them to know their whereabouts, as they could be pulled into becoming state witnesses if they were still alive. I do not mean to say that in a callous way, but there was a genuine belief, even at this point in the investigation, that Scully had also killed children after abusing them just because his pedophile customers had requested such video content from him. At this juncture in their investigation, I suppose, the Filipino police authorities would not put anything past Scully. He was capable of anything. The National Bureau of Investigation finally learned at some point that the baby in the video, Daisy, was still alive. The NBI was told that she had healed physically on the outside, but was left with extensive internal damages that are deemed irreversible and irreparable. Only time will tell what the mental trauma would be like for young Daisy. Meanwhile, Lisa was also tracked down by the NBI, who was thankful to learn that she was also still alive. However, for Cindy, the 11-year-old in the Daisy video, all efforts were too late. Cindy was found buried in a shallow grave in one of Scully's houses. In the segment by 60 Minutes Australia, the camera crew and host were shown the grave as the forensic team of the NBI dug up Cindy's skeletal remains. Even though these skeletal remains could not tell the full story of the hell that Cindy suffered at the hand of Peter Scully, the NBI did not really need it to. Lizelle Margallo, who abused Cindy and the 2 other girls in the Daisy video, told 60 Minutes Australia that whilst she was not involved in the video that contained the footage of Cindy's death, this is a separate video that was made after the Daisy video, she had seen this awful video herself. Margallo disclosed that Cindy was sexually abused, tortured, and then strangled to death on the video. She would also later reveal yet another disturbing detail. Cindy was made to dig her own grave before Scully finally ended her short life. I could not find any information as to whether this video really existed or whether the NBI had watched it themselves. From other videos online that covered the arrest of Scully, it looked like the NBI was able to track down other awful videos produced by Scully. So, they may have in their possession the video that showed Cindy's death. However, even without it, I do think that the police still felt like they had a good case against Scully due to Margalio's statement and the fact that Cindy was found buried in one of Scully's hideouts. On the 20th of February 2015, Peter Scully was finally arrested in one of his hideout houses. There were 6 warrants for his arrest. Later on, the Department of Justice recommended filing the following criminal charges against Scully and 6 other accomplices that included Margalio and Alvarez. The charges were 13 counts of rape, 6 counts of qualified trafficking in persons by a syndicate, 2 counts of qualified trafficking, 5 counts of syndicated child pornography, 9 counts of child abuse in relation to cybercrime, 5 counts of indecent shows, obscene exhibitions, and publications under the revised penal code, and 4 counts of child pornography in relation to cybercrime. As the news of Scully's arrest hit the headlines, more and more details would come out about the horrific things he had done for the last 3 to 4 years. Reports revealed, for example, that Scully preferred to use children below the age of 12. One of the children he victimized was just a year old, even younger than Daisy herself. The investigation before and after the arrest was headed by State Prosecutor Jinky Dadumo. In addition to all the intel from the Dutch and Australian police entities, the testimonies of Margalio and Alvarez, and the videos, Dadumo was also aided by testimonies by 45 witnesses who testified that the sexual abuses of the children were filmed on exclusive pornographic websites with payments collected from the mostly male viewers through online money transfers. It seems to me that Scully ran a very well-oiled business machine. The abuse of these children took place from April 2012 to around September 2014. In those witness testimonies, it was also finally discovered that both Margalio and Scully would not only video the sexual abuse of the children but also photograph it. The children were forced to perform sexual acts either by themselves or with each other, with Scully and or with Margalio. This was a confronting detail, according to the NBI investigators and their international counterparts who were with them on this journey of apprehending Scully. It is one thing to hear horrific details of sexual abuse and assault, but to hear about this, about mere children and a baby, can be jarring, to say the least. The DOJ and NBI also disclosed that in their investigation, they learned that Scully and his accomplices were most probably able to get away with their crimes for more than 2 years because they essentially designed a scheme in which they pretended to adopt the children with the promise of taking care of them, feeding them, and even sending them to school as they did with the children in the Daisy video. But as we now know, Scully never intended to do anything nice for these children. Furthermore, Scully and his accomplices had at times resorted to forcefully taking away or kidnapping children to include them in their sick enterprise. As already mentioned, in the case of the cousins, Scully and his girlfriends also had the habit of picking up kids off the street, taking advantage of their impoverished situation. So, what of Peter Scully now? After his arrest, Scully pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. Not long after, criminal proceedings were initiated. Scully was tried with his accomplices and four other men. During the trial, Scully joked and laughed with his co accused. A former lawyer revealed that Scully was treating prison like a vacation, demanding all sorts of things like fresh meat and a mobile phone. The sense of supremacy, arrogance, and entitlement was obviously strong in Scully. He probably thought that with his money and being a foreigner, he could easily get off or maybe bribe the powers that be to let him off the hook. And maybe he had real reasons to believe so. As it turns out, in 2015, whilst the trial was still ongoing, the evidence room that contained Scully's computer evidence was burnt down. It was rumored that Scully was able to bribe a police officer to burn down the place in order to weaken the case against him. Unfortunately for him, Peter Scully was eventually convicted in 2018 to life in prison after being found guilty by Judge Jose Escobedo of 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of rape by sexual assault of underage girls. Scully also faces an additional 6 to 9 years of imprisonment, and he has to pay 120,000 pesos in damages for each of the 5 counts of rape charges. Carmian Alvarez was convicted of human trafficking and also sentenced to life in prison. Acting General State Prosecutor Merlin Uy said that the court's decision was just for the first batch, as there are 50 more cases involving other victims and co-accused were still under trial at that point. Court reporters relayed that when he was convicted and sentenced, Peter Scully smiled, which is infuriating and odd, considering that before the trial ended, the Philippine government was seriously considering imposing the death penalty on Scully alone. Note that the death penalty has a rather oscillating history in the Philippines. It was abolished, reinstated, and suspended a few times, but at the time of Scully's trial, capital punishment was not available as a criminal sentence. As for Lizelle Margallo, she was apprehended by the police around the time of Scully's arrest in 2015, but she was poised to become a state witness. The prosecution was not planning to initiate proceedings against her as it was felt like they did not have enough evidence. At that point in their investigation into the Daisy video, they did not realize that one of the female accomplices was actually Margallo. I know I already told you at the beginning that Margallo was one of the people who tortured Daisy, but what I had not told you was that Scully's accomplices, the Filipino girlfriends in the video, were all covered in masks when they were abusing and torturing the children. So the police were not sure who those women were at the beginning. Margallo was obviously arrested on the general suspicion that she was somehow in a way involved in Scully's sick enterprise. So the police let her go. I guess at this point the police thought that even though she was Scully's girlfriend and she may have had a hand in the human trafficking side of things, they did not really think that she was an abuser of the children as well. But that would all change really quickly. By the time the investigators realized that one of the masked women in the Daisy video was indeed Margallo, she had already fled to Cebu in 2015. She was eventually arrested in 2017 on Malapascua Island after a 2-year manhunt. According to reports, prior to her arrest, she had been living a rather lavish life as she continued to profit off the proceeds from Scully's pedophile network. It seems from the reports at the time that Scully was still somehow able to run his depraved business with Margallo despite being in prison. Having said all that, the online sources seem to indicate that the second set of proceedings against Scully and Alvarez and the proceedings against Margallo are still ongoing. There have not been any new reports since 2019, and with the pandemic ongoing and the courts struggling to continue with proceedings in general, I do not think we will be hearing any new updates for another couple of years. But do remember, Peter Scully is but only one person in this systemic problem that is online sexual exploitation of children, or OSEC. OSEC. As we become more interconnected through the internet, and as technological developments keep charging forward with new things at every turn, the number of child victims of OSEC will just continue to grow exponentially. Recently, the International Justice Mission, or IJM, has put together very relevant and compelling data about the state of OSEC in the Philippines. It makes for a horrifying but necessary read. I have placed the link to the PDF in the sources list as well. In their report, the IJM attempted to collate and collect different types of data to create a picture of what is currently happening in the Philippines. IJM also seeks to advise and recommend ways forward for the government. In their own words, IJM says the following of their work. It is, and I quote, a starting point to trying to answer important and complex questions concerning the online sexual exploitation of children. A start to putting together that complex puzzle by thinking about how we can use the data we have to help to protect children. This initial picture then gives all stakeholders some suggestions for improving how we identify, track, and respond to these emerging crimes, which then will allow us to continue to piece the puzzle together. End of quote. Just so we are clear, the online sexual exploitation of children is defined as the production for the purpose of online publication or transmission of visual depictions like photos, videos, or live streaming of the sexual abuse or exploitation of a minor for a third party who is not in the physical presence of the victim in exchange for compensation. That is the definition used by IJM. Now, I know this might seem like research and statistics jibber jabber at this point, but please bear with me. I cannot stress enough how important it is to be aware of this problem and what international observers have seen happening in our country. Having said that, these are the 4 key findings of the report by IJM. First one, there was a consistent sharp rise in the number of IP addresses linked to the Philippines between 2014 and 2017. Secondly, the estimated number and prevalence rate of IP addresses used for child sexual exploitation each month grew more than 12-fold between 2014 and 2017. Thirdly, the estimated number or prevalence rate of IP addresses used for child sexual exploitation each year more than doubled between 2014 and 2017. And lastly, due to inconsistencies in the quality of the data within the open-ended text fields in the cyber tip line reports, it was not possible to estimate the percent of internet-based child sexual exploitation that is suspected to be officially OSEC. IJM also looked into the types of cases, victims, and perpetrators in their study and found that online sexual exploitation of children was usually a family-based crime. The abuse had likely gone on for years without intervention. Customers tend to be older men from Western countries, and traffickers tend to be younger Filipino women, often related to the victims. The main motivation for OSEC on the trafficker side is, of course, money. It would probably not surprise you that the fact that the IGM focused their study on the Philippines that the Philippines is the largest known source of OSEC cases in the world. Now, after collating and collecting all the data that they could from the Philippines, IJM made 10 recommendations to the Philippine government. Here are the first 5 that really drove home for me how important it is to really double down on the efforts in beating the problem of online sexual exploitation of children. Firstly, they recommended that the Philippine government should continue scaling up the staffing and budget for its anti trafficking law enforcement units until they reach authorized levels at a minimum. Secondly, international and Philippine law enforcement agencies should maintain and build on the improved relationships and communication practices that already exist between them to better hold perpetrators accountable and decrease criminal impunity globally. Thirdly, international and Philippine law enforcement agencies should ensure OSEC cases are routed to one of the Philippine anti trafficking units, either within the PNP or the NBI. Fourthly, government and non government service providers should ensure a collaborative, trauma informed, appropriate, and holistic system of care exists to address the unique needs of OSEC survivors on an individual, family, and community level. And lastly, child protection measures and trauma informed care should be implemented throughout the prosecution process of OSEC cases to protect victims from re traumatization. Bear in mind that the IJM study is not something that came out of nowhere. IJM and other Filipino and international agencies and organizations have worked in one way or another to help the country with its OSEC problem. As I said, Peter Scully is not the only one out there who had been committing horrible crimes against innocent Filipino children, and will by no means be the last. The OSEC problem has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. According to a BBC article, and I quote, in the UK, where 300 people are considered a threat to children, there were nearly 9 million attempts in the last month to access child sexual abuse websites, which had previously been blocked by the Internet Watch Foundation. End of quote. A further quote from the same article says, Spanish National Police say reports of online child sex videos leapt by just over 20% since just before the lockdown began on the 13th of March 2020. Their counterparts in Denmark revealed the number of attempts to access child abuse websites has trebled. End of quote. This very article reiterates that most of the images and content consumed by pedophiles on the dark net are produced in the Philippines. When you read the materials about the OSEC problem in the Philippines pre or during the pandemic, you will see that a lot of factors are mentioned and are cited to have essentially converged to make OSEC an even greater problem and threat. One of which is poverty, but also there's consumerism, materialism, media influences, and peer pressure. At a time when the Philippines was and is essentially still on lockdown and jobs are hard to come by, OSEC can seem a quick way out of poverty for those supplying the content. Lockdown can also mean, for the consumer side that is, there is a lot more time to be indulging in their depraved behavior. No wonder there has been a significant spike in online sexual abuse. Remember, however, that the supply would not be there without the demand. The demand for depraved media content from mainly the West is somehow another form of brute colonialism and oppression. Now, if there's anything at all that we've learned from our own history of colonialism and being colonized and oppressed by other foreign powers, There are always people who enable the oppressor. In reports and studies written and conducted on the Filipino OSEC problem, it has been shown over and over again that the parents and or immediate family are the primary traffickers of their own children and others. Something I've already mentioned earlier in connection to the IJM report. In that very report, it was explained, and this is the most heartbreaking part of it all. 41% of abuse cases were facilitated by the biological parents of the children, and 42% of their other relatives, or at least 83% by people related to the victims. Now, whilst we accept that poverty can drive some people to do horrible things, let us not forget that there would not be a supply without the demand by pedophiles who are already identified as mainly being from the West. Now, if you do get to read the IJM study or report, there is a particular case in there that was cited to clearly demonstrate the chain of supply and demand of OSEC material around the world. This is the Vilma case. In a nutshell, the Australian police arrested an Australian national who, upon further investigation, was said to have purchased child sexual exploitation material that could be traced back to the Philippines. This was then communicated to the PNP in the Philippines, who searched the supplier called Vilma. After surveillance, Vilma was arrested and the children in her care were interviewed. One of her daughters disclosed that the abuse and the online abuse had been going on for at least 5 years before the arrest. Upon further investigation, it was also revealed that Vilma supplied pedophiles in the UK and Germany as well. Whilst investigating her case, police also uncovered other evidence that helped identify consumers of child sexual exploitation material in other countries. These were all passed on to the right authorities abroad, and arrests were able to be made. Like I said, this is a global problem with the children at the center of all the trauma and abuse, but with little to no consequences for the consumers abroad. Again, please read the whole document if you can. I think it will greatly help us really understand the gravity of the problem. The young girls and boys who are being victimized today will suffer from long lasting psychological issues that will affect them for the entirety of their adulthood, affecting their relationships, education level, job seeking capabilities, and the way that they function in society. If there is one thing that I really wanted to communicate to you in this season ender episode for Lagim, is that please notice your surroundings. Please observe more. See the telltale signs of abuse and never think that these things are none of your business, because it is all of our business to ensure that the exploitation of children is stopped. And with that thought, I want to end this rather difficult episode. I have talked about this episode so many times already in the past without really naming it or telling you the specifics of the topic. It took me months to even write the script or even research it. It was a difficult episode to produce, mainly difficult emotionally. I had to stop and start so many times because the descriptions of the abuse and the stories of the children involved, not only in the Peter Scully case, were horrifying. So, thank you for being on this journey with me, and thank you so much for listening. Now, on a very different note, Lagim Podcast has been doing very well in its first 6 months. At the time of recording this episode, the podcast is approaching 30,000 downloads, something I thought would never happen. I cannot think of a better way to end this first season. During the podcast hiatus, please do not stop supporting the podcast. Keep telling your friends about it. Consider following us on Spotify and Apple Podcast, or maybe subscribing to our Patreon. You can also make a one-off donation to support the podcast using the Buy Me Coffee link on our Instagram bio. Also, make sure that you rate Lagim and leave a comment on Apple Podcasts. That really helps push this podcast to more listeners. And now to my podcast recommendation of the week. Now, I know we talked about Peter Scully and OSEC in this episode, so I want to recommend the podcast called Safe to Net Foundation's Safeguarding Podcast, specifically the episode from the 29th of August, 2020. I know the name of the podcast is quite a mouthful, so make sure that you check our show notes to get it right. The title of the episode that I'm recommending is The Supply and Demand of Encrypted Live Child Sex Abuse, which is an interview with John Tanagho, who is from IJM. The podcast is hosted by someone called Neil Fairbrother. In the episode, Neil interviews John, who speaks in depth about the IJM report I have mentioned in this case so many times. It is a very interesting episode, and I will make sure to also link the episode in the sources list. And with that, I want to thank you again for supporting the first season of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. We will be back for the second season on the 2nd of July, 2021. Abangan ang susunod na kabanata. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.